psychological study from the National Institute of Mental Health.
Just this morning, along with his longtime psychiatrist.
The circle of depression is growing wider, broader.
15% of women suffer from this disorder.
Affecting over 20 million Americans. Changes that have occurred in the brain.
Abnormalities in the neurotransmitters.
Is that a chemical imbalance?
Patient's got a problem, they've got a drug.
6 million American kids take prescribed medication.
Psychiatric care.
But what if the criminal is mentally ill?
The punishment, a form of aversion therapy.
I'm going to cure on the show, but I want to...
Crime, OCD.
Oppositional defiant disorder.
Schools criticized for overflow.
Everywhere you look, there it is. Think psychiatry has nothing to do with you? Think again. The whole field of psychiatry has gotten into every facet of your life.
They basically believe that everyone is mentally ill.
You smoke too much, it's a disease. You're too unhappy, it's a disease. You're too thin, it's a disease. You're too fat, it's a disease.
Where are these coming from? These are coming from the minds of psychiatrists that are dreaming these things up, writing papers and getting published with their names on it, creating these new diseases.
First he said that I had ADD. Then he said that I was depressed. Then he said I might be bipolar, but I don't have ADD anymore.
And he said, you know, I've been noticing you, and I wonder if you have it too.
What they decided is that both my husband and my son had a chemical imbalance that needed to be corrected with a chemical balancer.
There is not one shred of credible evidence that any respectable scientist would consider valid, demonstrating that anything that psychiatrists call mental illness are brain diseases or biochemical imbalances. It's all fraud.
There's no reliability of diagnosis, and there is no science. It's just pseudoscience. It's pretend science.
This is one of the most open secrets in all of America in the psychiatric field, that nothing is being done that's legitimate, and they're billing for it.
Psychiatrists claim that over 1 billion of the world's population is mentally ill. In the past 30 years, they have prescribed psychiatric medications to 543 million people. And right now, they drug 17 million school children with stimulants and antidepressants. When recently asked about the scientific basis of their profession, those psychiatrists willing to be interviewed offered nothing but excuses.
Psychiatric illness is not really illness.
How do you evaluate if someone is cured or sick?
Cure is certainly something we look forward to. We had no earthly idea how to accomplish.
We're not good at causes. We don't know what causes mental illness.
But that hasn't stopped them from pronouncing themselves mental health experts and treating people against their will. And the results?
This psychiatrist, man who's supposed to work to heal people, has done nothing but destroy this man's life, and in destroying his life, destroying the lives of all of his loved ones. Excuse me.
They've damaged and ruined my son, and they've trapped him in a system.
The way that they treated him and made him feel like he was worthless.
Bryant was being kept dumb and high on Ritalin so that they could make $2,500 per month.
He gave me Valium, and I got addicted to it.
It wiped out my life.
My life has been ruined. My joy has been stolen.
She was laying there. She took two gasps of air and died right there in front of me.
It is really tragic. It's awful. And it's being done for money. That's why it's being done.
Oh, it's got to be in the billions. I don't know the exact number, but it's got to be in the billions. It's just unbelievable.
This is so big that it boggles the mind.
Take the human tragedy you have just seen and multiply it by the millions. In the past 4 decades, nearly twice as many Americans have died in government psychiatric hospitals than in all U.S. wars since 1776. Insurance companies pay out $69 billion every year for psychiatric services, doubling the cost of medical insurance premiums. And while raking in over $2 trillion annually, psychiatrists cannot point to a single cure. Hard to believe? That's exactly what they count on. And as we will show you, it's how they have been getting away with it from the very beginning.
The roots of psychiatry have to do with control, power, and alienation from certain groups of people who were uncomfortable to be around. They were locked up in these places to get them out of the way. The history of psychiatry, I think, really is related to institutions.
Bethlehem Royal Hospital in London was one of the world's first psychiatric institutions. Commonly referred to as Bedlam, the hospital was little more than a warehouse for those deemed mad. Inmates were confined to cages, closets, and animal stalls, chained to walls, and flogged, while the asylum charged admission for public viewings. In the 18th century, William Batty was the first to promote that his institutions could cure the mentally ill. Batty's madhouses made him one of the richest men in England, though his treatments were every bit as inhumane as those practiced in Bedlam, with not a single patient cured. His financial success triggered a boom in the asylum business and an opportunity for psychiatrists to cash in on this new growth industry.
This was an era where, on both sides of the Atlantic, specialized institutions for the mentally ill are beginning to be built in large numbers. Those institutions date back certainly to the beginning of the 18th century, and in a few cases even earlier than that. But the explosive growth of an asylum sector, of asylumdom, as some historians have called it, is very much a 19th century phenomenon. It's that period when the state is persuaded to invest tax dollars in building these places.
But while those who ran the institutions were getting rich, psychiatrists yet lacked the credibility to maximize their cash flow.
In order to justify their profession, they needed to come up with these biological solutions, or they didn't have any profession. The only way for them to solve that was to attempt to start believing that these people that were suffering from emotional disorders was from a biological basis.
Whatever was done to make this person more manageable would be simply called a treatment. And the sad reality is that many of these so-called treatments were, in essence, torture.
The near-drowning devices that were developed in this period, for example, must have been appallingly frightening. For example, one device involved putting the patient into a coffin, closing the lid, and dumping it into a bath of water, and then opening it up and trying to revive the patient. There were a range of these things, and the mortality rate was very, very high.
Psychiatrists next sought to give credence to their practices by cloaking them in the language of medicine. This repackaging of treatment became known as the medical model.
Somebody who's really hyper and manic, if you're wrapped up in a cold sheet and dunked into some water, you're going to quit acting manic because that's a punishing treatment. But as soon as the symptoms started to go away, they started to believe that somehow by wrapping them up and dunking them in cold water, it was draining the toxics out of their body. So they built the medical model around that.
Pushing the biological theory of mental illness a step further, an American, Benjamin Rush, put forth the idea that insanity was caused by too much blood in the head. The cure? Remove the blood by any means possible. Restraint, cold water, bleeding, even terror. And with that, a new medical model was created.
Benjamin Rush was probably the most famous American physician of the Revolutionary era. Rush was known as the master bleeder. He bled his patients for madness. He also invented something called the tranquilizer. It's a chair that looks a little bit like an electric chair. The patient was confined in this apparatus sometimes with cold water applied to his or her head, for some hours at a time, and Rush announces in a letter that he's invented this new contraption and dubbed it the tranquilizer.
Rush's often lethal procedures were detailed in his 1812 textbook, which remained psychiatry's authoritative source for the next 70 years. He was so revered that in 1965, Rush was enshrined as the father of American psychiatry on the seal of the American Psychiatric Association. As the 1800s wore on, psychiatry's mounting failures at curing madness threatened their financial bottom line, forcing them to invent new medical models.
The cures promised were not delivered. So by the 1860s and 70s, a growing mood of pessimism was covering Europe and North America, that effectively the new institutions were ever growing in size, but not growing in their effectiveness.
The 20th century brought more medical models. American psychiatrist Henry Cotton mutilated his patients by removing their body parts, declaring this a breakthrough in the treatment of mental illness.
The earliest target was the teeth and then the tonsils and the sinuses, but when patients didn't get better, the enthusiasts for this treatment then started to move down the body and to say, well, obviously patients have swallowed bacteria in their saliva, so stomachs need to go, spleens need to go, colons need to go.
As public outcry escalated over torture and maiming of patients, psychiatrists would invent new methods, each one hailed as the miracle cure. But each one was ultimately proven no more effective nor less brutal than the last.
This is a history of psychiatry, more or less, to damage the patient. I mean, this is a version of the original model, which was to chain them like animals.
If you're doing it to somebody because you insist that they have to change, and you're going to do that by turning the screws, you might say, whether it's with medication, restraint, whatever, that's torture. And a huge part of what psychiatry has done really comes down to torture.
As the 20th century progressed, psychiatry would continue to seek legitimacy by transforming itself into a medical discipline. But they succeeded only in creating more efficient ways of inflicting mental and physical torture and death, a legacy that has carried forward into modern psychiatry, with its most profitable medical model to date, the mass drugging of millions. But to do this, psychiatrists first had to shatter one of mankind's most cherished beliefs, decreeing that people were not what they thought they were. Leipzig University, Germany, 1879. Professor Wilhelm Wundt experiments on the human senses. Wundt declares man's thoughts, personality, and behavior are nothing more than chemical reactions in the brain.
Wundt became frustrated with his inability to change behavior because he was dealing with the original, psychology. That's the psyche, that's the soul. He created a new science, which was based on man being an animal without a soul, to be trained. Not to be a thinker, but to be trained.
Students from around the world gathered to study Wundt's new definition of man as a soulless organism. The spirit of the age was summed up by German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche.
Gott ist tot. Gott bleibt tot. Wir haben ihn umgebracht.
Following Wundt's theory, a Russian, Ivan Pavlov, conducted animal experiments seeking methods to modify behavior.
Pavlov studied in Wilhelm Wundt's laboratory in Leipzig, Germany, in the late 1800s. And he experimented with dogs, with electrodes and stimulus response, denying privileges, to denying rewards.
And he noticed that when you brought out some food in front of
In February 2012 at Richford Gate Surgery, where I was assessed and sectioned on that day, it said I was sectioned because I was very guarded and suspicious. In other words, paranoid. When I was actually in the ambulance and I asked the senior social worker why I was being sectioned, she said to me I was being sectioned because they made the decision that I was disagreeable with my care. In other words, they asked me a question: are you disagreeable with any future decision we were about to make when the assessment was over? And I said, no, I'm not disagreeable. And when they came back and they sectioned me and put me in the ambulance with the police, the reason for doing it was I said I was disagreeable. It took them an hour to make the decision to say that I said I was disagreeable. But they asked that question just before leaving, and if I had answered I was disagreeable, I'd have been sectioned instantly instead of it taking an hour to make that decision and section me. I never said I was disagreeable, I said I was agreeable, and it was stated to me that I was not sectioned because I was suspicious, in other words, paranoid. So I'd like to ask about that, and I'd like you to look into that. Also, to verify it, Dr. Willis thinks I was sectioned for saying I was disagreeable because he's got a bad memory. That's debatable. He might have in fullness of time, he might remember properly or whatever, but the bit about me being sectioned for being paranoid, if he thinks I was sectioned for being disagreeable, and that's the reason, where does the whole thing about being paranoid come from, or suspicious? My legal case in amateur format, in absence of legal aid. It's the absence of legal aid that's causing them to break the law, not the amount of legal protection I have. They're moving in when they don't know I have a lawyer, and they're moving in to cover their own liability, and they're getting away with it. On point number 2, on the diagnosis, there were 2 admissions that year. On the first admission, what was the diagnosis? On the second admission, the symptoms that were given, how were these similar to the side effects of the medication? And if they were similar, is a second diagnosis because of that valid? In other words, you're mixing up the symptoms of the medication with the symptoms of what you say is an illness. On the second admission, it says it thought of might have met the criteria on A. What's it called? The International Classification of Diseases. A, thought echo, and E, hallucinatory voices, and F, presence of formal thought disorder. Might. There's no difference between might and did. You get a decision made on something that has actually happened. Might is supposing. Actuality is different. How can assessments be made on might or possible when a definite outcome is required? In the consultation with Dr. Qureshi on the 16th of September 2010, it is said she noted at that consultation that I hear voices in my head and I'm convinced others can hear and read my thoughts. Now, at that particular consultation, Nicola Wakeham was present, and she can verify that I've never said to her or at that consultation or at any time that I'm convinced others can hear and read my thoughts. I've never said it, and I never said it at that consultation with Dr. Qureshi. because she. In issue 1.1, I'm very bad at this categorization. Who made the diagnosis of schizophrenia in 2004? Well, on that particular point, you haven't answered and said who made the diagnosis of schizophrenia in 2004, either on the first admission or maybe the second, but definitely you haven't said who made the diagnosis of schizophrenia in 2004. Why was that answer omitted? In February 2012 at Richford Gate Surgery, where I was assessed and sectioned on that day, it said I was sectioned because I was very guarded and suspicious. In other words, paranoid. When I was actually in the ambulance and I asked the senior social worker why I was being sectioned, she said to me I was being sectioned because they made the decision that I was disagreeable with my care. In other words, they asked me a question: are you disagreeable with any future decision we were about to make when the assessment was over? And I said, no, I'm not disagreeable. And when they came back and they sectioned me and put me in the ambulance with the police, the reason for doing it was I said I was disagreeable. It took them an hour to make the decision to say that I said I was disagreeable. But they asked that question just before leaving, and if I had answered I was disagreeable, I'd have been sectioned instantly instead of it taking an hour to make that decision and section me. I never said I was disagreeable, I said I was agreeable, and it was stated to me that I was not sectioned because I was suspicious, in other words, paranoid. So I'd like to ask about that, and I'd like you to look into that. Also, to verify it, Dr. Willis thinks I was sectioned for saying I was disagreeable because he's got a bad memory. That's debatable. He might have in fullness of time, he might remember properly or whatever, but the bit about me being sectioned for being paranoid, if he thinks I was sectioned for being disagreeable, and that's the reason, where does the whole thing about being paranoid come from, or suspicious? It says here in, I believe you call it the same issue that I was on before, that I fired my consultant in 2006 for irregularities. On the 5th of May 2006, and I have a letter here, I went down to Gloucester House with a WLMHT, I believe, but definitely a PALS advisor, to look at my file. Now, we found the financial irregularities, and the reason for going there, a record of that would be with the PALS advisor. However, although technically speaking, I went down to look at my file because I figured out my bank details were in there, namely speaking because I questioned Dr. Qureshi about how she knew something and she told me, and they shouldn't have been there because somebody sent it to her and they shouldn't have sent it to her. Anyhow, the bank details is only a technical wrongdoing. The real reason I fired her was because in the previous consultation I had with her, she started telling me she was talking to my father. And I fired her. The real reason for talking to my father. And I didn't know about it until then. And I don't think she's supposed to be talking to my father. And even if she is, I felt so horrible about it, I fired her. And that's the reason. At the clarification meeting on the same issue here with Dr. Jolly, he mentioned that the Maudsley did not have the full facts in which to make an assessment. Reading out here, it says, that no attempt appears to have been made by staff involved in the Maudsley assessment to thoroughly review the records of my past contact with psychiatric services. Now that's in the written report into the complaint. Thoroughly review the records of past contact. In other words, they don't have the full facts. What he's saying basically is he's undermining the assessment of the Maudsley because it didn't have the full facts. I would like him to get on to the Maudsley and to question them whether or not they had the full facts, and to put to them that he thinks that their assessment is to be undermined, and to explain why to them, or to come up with an explanation. Once again, I'd like to question whoever wrote the report. It might not be Dr. Jolly on this point, that I answered in the affirmative when asked whether or not I heard voices at the Maudsley. Now, I don't even know what that means. But what's important is it says, no wonder at the Maudsley that they thought that the diagnosis of schizophrenia was poorly founded on the basis of this evidence. Then it says the clinical records, however, shows that on the second admission in 2004, considerably more detailed than this psychotic experiences at the time of your second admission, whatever that means. What that means is basically they've got details that's saying that I expressed things about myself in more detail than what the Maudsley had. On the second admission, I was adjusting to medication, and I'd only been on the medication 2 or 3 months. And while adjusting to the medication, I want to know if during that period the side effects peak and if they are similar to the symptoms of schizophrenia. In other words, what I expressed was side effects to my medication as opposed to schizophrenia, considering the point in time. And also, once again, you're undermining the Maudsley's assessment. I'd like to know why, and if you have a problem with the Maudsley. It says here, Dr. Phelan stated that he was aware at the time that when I was supposed to have been put down on record as experiencing delusional beliefs, that these delusional beliefs may have represented realistic concerns regarding experiences with neighbours. Now, they're realistic concerns, he's saying, not delusional beliefs. The fact that Dr. Phelan said this, I believe, undermines what's been said about me having delusional beliefs. And let's see if there's anything else here that's useful. And it says, at the time they may have represented realistic concerns regarding experiences which have been distorted through the prism of Asperger's syndrome. Now, the prism of Asperger's syndrome means that WLMHT, since it's from Dr. Phelan that said it, is given validity to the diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome. Why are you contradicting yourself, giving validity to the Maudsley diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome, whereas earlier you seem to be making statements that undermine it? There's a lack of continuity to what you're saying. There's a lack of reliability in your opinion, if that's what it is, because it seems to change, and you stand on what you say, and then it changes, and it's the opposite, and you stand in it. And I'd like you to address that. Dr. Dale and his colleagues stated in the medical report to the tribunal, though we have not observed overt signs of illness, schizophrenia on the ward, I'm not symptomatic, there is strong evidence of his relapse and response to delusional ideas. Now here's what's important. Dr. Dale and his colleagues at the tribunal stated on the medical report That's part of the written evidence. On the actual court report, Dr. Dale is not referred to as an author of the medical evidence. There's 3 authors. There's 2 doctors, and there's Ken Little. I may be wrong on this, I'm going to double check now, but I don't see him as an author of the written evidence on which the tribunal based its decision. So, why is he... I have checked it out and I'm correct. First tier tribunal, mental health, 29th and 2nd, 2012. Written evidence, Dr. Armanyous, Armanyous, Mr. OnyekWali, and also Mr. Little, Ken Little. That's the written evidence, which will include the medical report. Now, those are the authors of the written evidence. Why was Dr. Dale, as an author, omitted in the court report as an author of the written evidence? You can say that's a typo, but either way, the written evidence that he is shown to be the author of, if it's a typo, you can only do that if you chase up the written evidence to show there's a typographical error. Dr. Jolly states that in his interview with me, I was asked on first being admitted to the hospital, do ideas pop into your head? And I said yes, and sarcastically added, being cynical, have a cigarette. But what was noted down was simply yes. And on this, that had an impact on their diagnosis. He says this was very poor evidence on which they found a diagnosis. And he questions the likelihood of it being true. Now he's going with the argument of likelihood as to how best to decide whether or not this is the basis of me being asked. Seeing as there's a lack of documentation on admission 1, and the only record or indication of the truth is an eyewitness account, and that's the basis on which the likeliness of it is to be measured. The eyewitness account was me, and they said, do ideas pop into your head? And I said, yes, have a cigarette, and that had a basis or a major impact on their decision. Now, the fact that I'm an eyewitness means that it is the likeliness comes from me being an eyewitness, not unlikeliness based on other evidence that he seems to look at. If he looks at the actual evidence that's there, that's me, he'll find that it's likely that they'd based the decision on it, because I was there at the time. And get him to find the other witnesses, please, and documentation. If there isn't documentation, in the absence of it, I question that decision. Further, in looking at the answer in this issue, it said that I was very paranoid and anxious and blocked the door of a ward to Dr. Armanyous. Now, I remember that. I didn't block the door. He was walking out, and as he walked out, I talked to him. He answered my question and continued on his way. There was no blocking of the door. But in the actual tribunal hearing, when they were talking about it, they said that in talking to him for a minute, that was another example of me hostage taking. Then I talked to him for a minute, I took up a minute of his time. They made out that in the report that was written, I took him hostage. Now that's a false accusation of hostage taking, and I didn't block him at the door. I talked to him for a minute about my care. I just asked him a question, and he stopped and he went on his way. So there was no blocking of the door. And at the tribunal hearing, they said that so-called blocking at the door that didn't exist was hostage. There may be a misunderstanding here as well with this issue. It relates to Dr. Qureshi at the surgery, And she said, I appeared to be vague and confused and used neologisms, whatever that is. Anyhow, vague, confused and neologisms and all of that. Yet, in the ambulance, the senior social worker told me I was being locked up for not saying that I was disagreeable with my care, any decisions that they were going to make about me. Now that's given us the reason for being locked up, but here it says Dr. Qureshi said I was locked up for being vague and confused and other reasons. Now if there are other reasons and Dr. Qureshi says it, does that mean that there's a documentation of her assessment that's different to the senior social worker? And if it is, and if it's a report about her assessing me at Richwood Gate, it has nothing to do with me being disagreeable with my care, but that question was asked. Could I have a copy of that report and look at it? And could I have her account compared with the account of the doctor that was there, the GP, Dr. Willis, to see if there's any contradictions or to clear things up? Thank you very much. I'm not in a, why I shouldn't be doing this. Considering I was giving a full assessment at the Maudsley and diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, and there was lack of assessment, in other words, I wasn't given a full assessment but a quick test in my mind at Charing Cross. The full assessment diagnosed me with Asperger's. Dr. Jolly states that in addition to a diagnosis of schizophrenia, in addition to that of Asperger's, was correct. He's put that down as an assessment to be correct. Now, what assessment? I've never been... It says at the Maudsley report, I've no comorbidity for any other illness. I've Asperger's. So where's he getting this? My diagnosis of schizophrenia, in addition to that of Asperger's, was correct. That's the outcome of an assessment. What assessment's he talking about? The only full assessment was at the Maudsley. In this statement, the result he refers to is the result of an assessment. What assessment is he talking about? Could you please look at that? Is he making a statement about an assessment and no assessment existed? Because basically I've got single diagnosis of Asperger's. There's no assessment for a dual diagnosis. Where did they come up with that when there's never been a full assessment? I remember, and I have a type of pink slip for discharge, if that's the same piece of paper you're referring to. It says CT scan or CAT scan as physical investigations, if allowed by the patient. Apart from maybe taking your blood or something, if you're talking about all the physical investigations and CT scan stands for CAT scan, I was never given all the physical investigations because I was never given a CAT scan. That's number one. Number two, in the building I was in, there isn't a CAT scan. And nobody ever gets transferred to casualty, and I talked to others there since, and they all said they didn't get a CAT scan. All right, that's one point. Okay, collateral information from informants, and then it says, if allowed to by the patient. Now, on my first examination, there was no, and the second one, if you're talking about the two admissions that year, I was not aware of anyone giving information about me. I don't think they did. Information from informants, I never allowed that, and I never allowed information to be given me from informants. And if it's a part of the criteria that you have to have collateral information from informants, I don't believe anyone came forward and gave that information, and I didn't give my permission. And this whole thing about it. Issue number 3. There are two. Well, let's see. You got the points, right? looking at the main points. Okay, what's happened in issue number 3 is they've put the 2 main points together and just put them, they've sort of combined them as a single issue, and here goes. The first point is, where did the diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia come from? And added to this is, was this a factually incorrect diagnosis given to the tribunal in 2012? Okay, I'm addressing the issue. It says here the diagnosis was incorrect in the sense that it reflected the working diagnosis being employed by the team. Now, in addressing the point in the text, it's been written that the diagnosis was incorrect, or was not incorrect rather, in the sense that it reflected the working diagnosis of the team being employed. Now, the working diagnosis of the team being employed, does that mean they're going on past knowledge as opposed to observation? If they're going on past knowledge as opposed to observation, why am I there if I'm not being observed? I mean, they make the assessment on what they see. That's number one. And number two, the tribunal was acquainted with concerns that I may have an alternative or additional diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome. Well, if they're looking out for autism, why didn't it say anywhere whether or not I had autism? Or if they thought that there was a chance of me having autism, what moves were made for me to go to the Maudsley? Because I'd like to know how I was referred to the Maudsley. Was it a result of being in front of the tribunal and the doctors coming out of the hospital, or was it separate later? Was it from my GP, in other words? Okay, this is why you don't have a mental health patient or DIYing, because this is why it's not the ideal. Here goes. Oh, something simple as this. It's unclear, but it's clear to a professional. The diagnosis was not incorrect in the sense that it reflected a working diagnosis being employed. Now, if each time you're going out there, the diagnosis is correct because it reflects a working diagnosis, and there's a lack of observation. If going out there through not being observation and simply going on what's in the past and saying, yes, the person's got a diagnosis of that, without looking for and observing each time to whether the person has it, isn't diagnosis coming from looking for and observing at the time you're in there to see if you have symptoms, and from that identifying them and saying that the person has the symptoms and giving evidence that these symptoms have been identified? Now, if it's done just on a working diagnosis that you're going along with, and the person doesn't get an individual diagnosis of still having or presenting the symptoms each time he's in and out, is there a lack of diagnosis over the years each time a person's in and out, in that if no symptoms are observed each time they just go, oh, well, it's a working diagnosis, someone said he had it in the past? I mean, is there a flaw here? On this particular one, I'm not qualified. Well, naturally, I'm not qualified in any of this, but I'd like this to be looked at and answered. You can make of it what you want. And this is the end of issue number 3. I'll go on. Okay, issue 4, I'll run through it quickly. How has the Trust been complying with the Royal College of Psychiatrists' guidance and recommendations for psychiatric services for adolescents and adults with Asperger's syndrome and other autistic spectrum disorders outlined in the Council Report CR136? Now, that Council Report goes back 10 years, so you have to evidence over the last 10 years how you've been complying with the guideline, or if you've been using the guideline. Okay, I have to address this. It's a pretty technical report or whatever, so all I can do is give a sort of synopsis of it, or whatever you want to call it. Here goes. The Trust has supported the development of a specialist clinic for attention deficit disorder. That's not what I'm interested in. Oh yes, it supports local initiatives to improve awareness. Well, the obvious question there is you support local initiatives at places such as the Claybrook Centre, etc. Now, local initiatives, what does that mean? Does that mean that in the actual hospital of Charing Cross, on the psychiatric wards, you're looking out for it? When you say local initiatives, you mean you look out for it outside of the hospital? If that's the case, inside in the hospital with adults, are you looking out for it to people being admitted who haven't been to the Claybrook Centre? And are you looking out for it in adults that are in there that have had another diagnosis to see whether or not they have an autistic spectrum disorder? That's one. Well, the next point is it's very easy. In the Claybrook Centre, development of a specialist clinic for attention deficit disorder and autistic spectrum disorders, and it's run by Dr. Christopher Mullard-Pollard, a consultant psychiatrist who has a special interest in these conditions. Now, the development of the centre outside of the hospital, where you may or may not already be looking out for it and diagnosing for it, the development implies that you're putting in process looking out for it. Well, if that's the case, according to CR 136, over the last 10 years, have you not been looking out for it and diagnosing it? I'll go on to the next point, and then this is absolute nonsense, because this is an analysis that someone else should be coming up with, or to be able to come up with better, which is a flaw in this DIY approach. Okay, this bit's easy. Dr. Christopher Mullard, the consultant psychiatrist, has a special interest in this. So anyone who comes in front of him, he'll be looking out to see whether or not that person's autistic. And if anyone should know, if the person in front of him is lucky enough to have Dr. Pollard, he should know. So if you're autistic, he'll spot it. Well, he was my doctor over the years, and I saw him a couple of times, and I've no complaints against him. He's quite a nice guy. But seeing as I was diagnosed at Charing Cross Hospital with, I don't know how much input he had in that. I don't think he had any. Not Charing Cross, at the Maudsley, as being autistic. When he was in front of me, or I was in front of him, and I was autistic, and he's a specialist in autism, how come he didn't spot that I was autistic? Was it that he wasn't on the lookout for it, or was it that he might have been on the lookout for it, but he hadn't the processes in place to do anything, even if he did observe it? I'd like to know why I was in front of him and he didn't put down anything about me being autistic in my notes. And of course there's the last bit here. I'm merely asking questions. You've given me the information on this, and this isn't really, it says this is not a complaint, the bit I have here, but rather a request for information. So a complaint, within that you can be saying why. So I'm looking at the request and I'm not complaining. I don't complain. Why is this? Is this right? Is this wrong? Whatever. I'm not complaining. I'm just asking why. It's up for you to come up with an answer. It doesn't really matter anyway, because you can't say it's a substandard question, because this is the DIY process you put in place, so we have to do it ourselves. This is actually the problem with a DIY process of handling a complaint. So here goes my little DIY thing. It says autistic spectrum disorder services offered by Hammersmith Fulham Learning Difficulty Service. The facilitation of referral for assessments when commissioner funding is provided to the behavioural genetics unit. Now this means assessment based on funding available. Can there be a proper looking out for and meeting the actual targets that they should be meeting, and getting all the people out there that are autistic and getting them tested, if it's so subject to funding that you can't do it with everyone if you try. In other words, you can't get the total number of people who've possibly got autism tested because there are funding restrictions. Now, if that's the case, if there's a law that says that people that have been wrongly diagnosed with autistic disorder should be tested to see whether or not they have it, but it's limited due to funding, is there a shortfall in the referral due to a lack of funding that may affect your overall duty of care, whatever it is, to your client group? It's ridiculous to ask a mental health patient to do this, to come up with this type of analysis, but that's the way you've set this thing up. You mightn't be happy. Issue 5. How can the Trust evidence that it is assessing for autism as part of the mental health assessment process? The next one is, since 2004, what was or is the Trust's protocol for assessing someone with autism? Then please provide a copy of a guidance to the staff for this since 2004. I'd like to know why in the day at Douglas Wamphara, when the evidence was frivolous, there were things being said that Dr. Walsh read out twice, both before and after and during the tribunal, that I was a hostage taker. Now, everything that was being read out, a lot of it was nonsense. Douglas says keep my mouth shut and he would represent me. Why didn't he challenge them on the allegations and say prove it? These are scurrilous allegations. And why, instead of challenging them, did he just read out a sentence, say nothing, and the tribunal ignored him and went on with business? Because he didn't challenge the tribunal. I'd like to know how I have a lawyer and they say scurrilous allegations. Okay, each one of these I have to question so I can give depth from looking at it, or I can give you some information back about what I think about it. Here goes. You're on about a screening questionnaire and a scoring system that's been given to people. When you send out a screening questionnaire so that the doctors look at it, does that mean that they read the screening questionnaire and they just tick a few boxes and send it back to you? Or does that mean that when they have the screening questionnaire, that they use that with each patient that comes into Charing Cross? Okay, so I jumped too far ahead there. The screening questionnaire is used when deemed clinically appropriate. That means the person who's assessing the patient in front of him and is looking out for autism, he can do it when it's clinically appropriate because he knows a thing or two about whether or not someone has autism. Now here's the question. That comes from training. Can you evidence the training that the doctors or whoever it is that does the observation has in looking out for autism in terms of what the qualifications they have, whether or not there's within that a qualification for looking out for autism, or what the training is of the staff, whether the staff evidence the training that the staff have had for looking out for autism. Because it's done when deemed clinically appropriate, use a questionnaire. To be deemed clinically appropriate and make that decision, whoever makes the decision has to have some type of training in looking out for autism, and that has to come from a qualification or included in a qualification. And could you clarify that point, what the training is of the staff in looking out for autism so they can use the questionnaire? Terrible to make a mental health patient go through this, because, oh well. When you enter Charing Cross Hospital, nowadays you're supposed to use assessment teams. Maybe you've always used them. But when you use an assessment team and someone goes in front of a little sort of round table of doctors, whatever system you set up, or a few doctors look at the person, is one of those doctors trained in looking out for autism? Right, still on issue 6. It is important to note that decisions to detain a person in hospital and decisions of mental health tribunals as to whether or not to release a person is based primarily upon diagnosis. Is based not primarily upon diagnosis, but rather whether a person has some form of mental disorder, be it schizophrenia, psychosis, depression, anxiety, or anything else, and whether or not it's of sufficient severity to necessitate detention in the interest of the person's health or safety with a view of protecting others. Now here goes. Whether or not to once you're detained, they decide whether or not to release you, not upon diagnosis, but whether or not the person has some form of mental disorder. Now here's the thing, if it's not upon diagnosis and it's a mental disorder, those mental disorders you talk about, be it schizophrenia, psychosis or depression, in and themselves can't just be bandied around as a label. They're actually descriptions of a mental illness. Now, you can't tell me schizophrenia isn't a mental illness. So it's based on whether you have a mental disorder like mental illness. Now, it's not based on diagnosis. Those mental disorders, those mental illnesses like schizophrenia, are in themselves mental illnesses that, in order to have legal authority to detain someone of that description of a mental illness, that requires, in my mind, a diagnosis. You can't say that it's nothing to do with holding a person in a hospital because you're saying he's schizophrenia, and then say there's no diagnosis for the schizophrenia. So where does the basis of holding them comes from in saying that label is true? To say that label is true, it has to be based on a diagnosis. Now you're saying it's not based on a diagnosis, and I'd like for you to clear that up and address that, because you can't be having people in there and saying you're not putting them in there on diagnosis, and then you bandy around labels like schizophrenia. Okay, the other bit's easy. You get detained in the hospital in the interest of the person's health or safety with a view of protecting others. Now, I've no history of violence, etc. While I was in the hospital, I didn't exhibit any type of... Show me where I exhibited behaviour where it was a danger to myself, where that was documented or observed. And protecting others, I didn't have a go at anyone. I was peaceful when I was in there. So I was detained in the hospital in the interest of protecting myself. Whereas the evidence while in the hospital, I did something I had to protect myself from, and others had to be protected from me. I mean, this seems to be just a description you're using from being in there. I'd like, since you're using that description, and that's the weight, legal weight for keeping me in there, I'd like you to evidence where I was a danger to others, or I needed to protect it from myself. Since I'm in there and I'm under observation, you'll have that evidence, so clear that up and address that and get the evidence, because that's why I was not unlawfully detained because 2 doctors provided medical recommendations stating that I suffered from a mental disorder. Would that mental disorder be schizophrenia? And Okay, it says I was not unlawfully detained. 2 doctors provided medical recommendations stating that I suffered from a mental disorder and it was necessary to detain me and for the protection of others in the hospital. And an approved mental health practitioner made the application for my detention. Now here's the thing, 2 doctors. In the room with me, the 2 doctors were Dr. Qureshi and Dr. Willis. Now, they provided medical recommendations. The 2 doctors that provided them, were those the same 2 that were in the room, or was it someone, just another doctor came along and provided a medical recommendation? What I'm asking is, who were the 2 doctors that provided medical recommendations? Because as far as I'm concerned, it was Dr. Willis of Richard Gate, and it was Dr. Qureshi. But I'd like to know who they were. An approved mental health professional subsequently made an application. Now the thing about it is that was an assessment team as far as I'm concerned, and the approved mental health professional was on the phone to Greg O'Regan when I was being examined, and I was on the phone to him all the time, and the mental health professional gave her name. Now I never saw her before, and I thought the person that was head of the assessment team was Tim Gorvash. I'd like to know, as a senior social worker who was on the phone to Greg O'Regan at PALS, P-A-L-S, Ealing Hospital, I think, who was that approved mental health professional? And I don't know who it was. I never saw the person before in my life. And why was CRT in there? Considering I was put there to be detained. It said my treating doctor and nursing staff provided reports. Now, I'd like to know who my treating doctor was, because on the court, whatever you want to call it, the tribunal report that came out, it mentioned the people who provided the reports, the written evidence. Dr. Dale's name wasn't there. Did Dr. Dale provide reports to the tribunal? You might need clarification on the last point. I was told I could go 2 days later, and I tried to see Dr. Dale so I could be let go and maybe discharged a week later or whatever to come back. When I tried to see Dr. Dale so I could be let go, allowed to go, the staff wouldn't let me see him. They said I needed an appointment. And I did everything I could to get an appointment, and they wouldn't let me have an appointment to see Dr. Dale, even though he's in the room opposite them. And the only way I got an appointment to see him was another mental health patient had an appointment in that 2 hours that he sees somebody on a Friday, and she gave me her slot, and I told her I needed to be there to get released. And I sat down with Nicola Wakeham, and Dr. Dale says, "You're free to go." But I wouldn't have got that free to go if the staff at reception and the nurses and everyone else had their way, because they were making out that I needed an appointment. But when I went in 2 weeks earlier and had to see him on a Friday, you just went in to see him, you waited in a line, and there was no need then to make an appointment. Now all of a sudden there was a need to make an appointment, and if I can't see him, I can't get released. One of the members of staff, the nursing staff from the reception, some guy that is a rugby fan, he's white in Twickenham, and he's overweight or whatever, black hair, took it personally when I didn't watch not a cricket match, a rugby match on a Saturday or something. I don't know what's wrong with the guy, it's mental health, so I don't have to watch a rugby match if I don't want to. But anyhow, he sat in, and he knew what the findings were based on what was said, that I was free to go. And I was asking him for an appointment so I could see Dr. Dale, because I was free to go, and he wouldn't let me in. And also, at the tribunal, it would have been helpful if Dr. Dale was there, but Dr. Dale was not at the tribunal. Maybe he doesn't have to be, he just has to be informed, but he wasn't there. Maybe it's useful that Dr. Dale attends those tribunals, so people are told they can go, they don't mess us about, and we can see him, and we can go, we don't even have to see him. He just comes up to us and tells us we can go on the ward. Okay, this one's easy. It says I was provided with legal representation. The legal representation was Corporate Solicitors, and the solicitor, whatever he's called, was called Douglas, Douglas Wamborough. Now, the problem that I'm having with Douglas Wamborough is when I called Corporate Solicitors, I said he works for you because I have a letter from them saying they were sending me his lawyer. They said to me, he doesn't. So I said, well, indirectly he does. You know he does. And he says, okay, he does. But before that, they said he was a consultant. Now, if I have a lawyer with me, I have to sign documents to say he's my lawyer. I didn't sign any documents, firstly. And secondly, he's my lawyer. So I needed to see him in the next week so I could do an appeal to the tribunal. Now, the next week he was missing, and I didn't get the tribunal report for another few months. how can I have a lawyer who doesn't inform me of an appeal? Staff in the hospital don't inform me of an appeal. The mental health professional, or whatever the hell she's called, Daisy Day, the mental health act officer, doesn't tell me that I have to appeal within a week. And evidence is provided in the form of medical reports that are read out by Dr. Walsh. And in order to look at what he's reading out, Douglas Womberer had a copy that he was reading out. Back to Dr. Walsh, they both had a copy. No, Douglas Womberer had that copy, so I tried to get in contact with him. Right after, over a week after the tribunal, I couldn't contact him. When I phoned corporate solicitors, he wasn't available. Then they said to me they couldn't find their own lawyer. And on the Susie Payne tried to contact him to get a copy of the medical reports, and she wasn't able to get a copy of the medical reports of him. Now, if a lawyer represented me on the day, and I haven't got any written documentation, I didn't sign anything to say he could represent me. Not alone do I have someone who represented me on the day, but he disappeared, and he's supposed to be my lawyer and represent me, and I can't find him, and I need the information that he has on me, for which I put in a Freedom of Information request, and I asked him for my file. He could still be legally represent me for all I know, but he's gone. I'd like for the information he had on him that day to be sent to me, my entire file from Douglas Womberer at Corporate Solicitors, Fleet Street. At the tribunal, I was told a decision was made that everything down there was ridiculous, scurrilous allegations by the magistrate, and I was free to go. But everything that was decided and agreed on, we left the room and were told they were going to look at the written evidence. Now, Douglas was outside the room with me, and I asked him to go in there with them, and they were making a decision on the written evidence, and all he said was, be careful, don't do anything. Now, why wasn't Douglas in the room challenging them on the written evidence, considering he had it in his hand? And also, what they decided upon informally, that I was free to go, and what everybody agreed on, and we all had a little hug fest. Why was that different to what was written on the actual tribunal report that came out at the end? Because it seems the paperwork and how I was assessed on paper, which was an account of what was decided at the tribunal, was completely different to what happened at the tribunal. I was told I was free to go, and the staff wouldn't let me go, and they wouldn't let me have an appointment to see Dr. Dale, and they ignored. Issue 8 is at the end of the page, and there's a bit of a blank. There might be a typo here, because the space for a point seems to be missing, and then on the next page at the top there's a point, so check out whether or not there's a point missing. But at the top of the next page, the point is, throughout my experience with this trust, there has been a lack of diagnostic approach assessment. Instead, there seems to be a one-size-fits-all approach. Everyone seems to be the one thing all the time, schizophrenic. Do you agree that there has to be a variation in order to be diagnostic, and that, well, basically, what's fashionable shouldn't affect the variation? In terms of psychiatry, things coming in and out of fashion, etc. The clinical notes and reports related to you, related to your hospital admission in 2012 indicates that staff were well aware of the possible additional or alternative diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome during the course of your admission. The clinical notes upon admission, could I have a copy of those clinical notes upon admission? Okay, Dr. Jolly's been very good here. in response to what was said before. It's not the case that all patients under the care of the Trust are diagnosed as suffering from schizophrenia. Dr. Jolly has requested information from the Trust's IT department to provide an anonymised breakdown of the diagnosis of patients in care. The Trust's local services, which will show that there is a wide range of diagnoses made. Now, it says anonymised breakdown. I've been in contact with Dr. Jolly by email, and I would like that anonymised breakdown to be compiled, and I'd like you to show over the next 10 years per year how many cases of people have been diagnosed as adults. Okay, Dr. Jolly was very good on this particular point. I'd sent him some information as how he might display what he sends me, but it says with the demands of the IT department, I'm not going to get the information immediately now. That was 2 months ago, and I thought you could just press a button and get the information instantly off the computer. I believe that the delay has been too long, and at this stage I'd like to get the information in a timely fashion, just for Dr. Jolly to tell me how he's going to display the information and when I'm going to get it, and for it not to be an anonymised breakdown, but for it to basically be compiled in a way that's more meaningful and show the total diagnosis of, I don't know, autistic spectrum disorder, Asperger's syndrome, over the last 10 years as a proportion of what's there overall, and also schizophrenia and paranoid schizophrenia. But even if what I especially want is autistic. Okay, the next bit in the text is, in order to make a reliable diagnosis for conditions such as schizophrenia, it's become recognised in recent years that it's important to have information not only on the pattern of symptoms at a particular point in time, but at the ebb and flow of the symptoms, etc. And for this reason, since the early inception of the early intervention and psychosis services, patients suffering from psychotic symptoms, you wait for 3 years until after you make an assessment on somebody suffering from psychotic symptoms. Now, I'd like to know, if you wait 3 years and you observe psychotic symptoms or whatever, how does that assessment compare to the Maudsley way of assessing people for an illness such as schizophrenia? Because they sit you down for 5 hours and they give you an intensive assessment. On this, you just see someone and you get information back here and there from a social worker, and then in the fullness of time you make that decision. Also, if you're making decisions 3 years after, could I have an account of when a person first goes in and exhibits signs of something like schizophrenia, how that is noted, and then there's a 3-year delay, and after that how a diagnosis comes about and is noted. In other words, looking at people for initial signs of schizophrenia and see if there's a 3-year delay until a diagnosis, if that's how you do it. And also compare how you do it, look out for schizophrenia, compare to places such as the Maudsley, how your assessment is different to theirs, and how that holds up. Ask the Maudsley what they think of your assessment process, basically, because theirs is different to yours. And there seems to become some confusion over which is the right way to do it. And I'm sure you're doing it the right way, but maybe just contact the Maudsley for learning curve. Okay, here goes. Dr. Jolly contacted Mrs. Diana Wiggins, the team manager of the North Recovery Team, to discuss your concerns regarding the withdrawal of your support worker. According to Mrs. Wiggins, this was not done to victimise me for complaining, in order to prevent me from being tested for autism. So that means there's no pattern of making a complaint and losing your support. On my first complaint within 2 days of it registering, I got sectioned. That could have been a coincidence. But when I was let go from the hospital, within 2 days of an appointment being made to see an investigator, I had my support worker, Nicola Wakeham, withdrawn from me or whatever. Diana Wiggins sent me a letter and she said she was withdrawn or taken away from working with me in relation to complaint 1. And there's documented evidence there, and I put it in writing. That's 1. It's documentation. She's admitted herself in her own writing that she was withdrawn in relation to complaint 1. Number 2, she says there's no pattern. When I put in complaint number 2, the one where I had to go see Dr. Jolly, she wasn't just withdrawn from my case, but she wasn't available at Old Oak. Basically, within 2 days of me sending complaint number 2 in the post, on the day that I sent it, she was withdrawn as my support worker. Now, that's pretty punctual, and that's the same thing repeating itself. That to me looks like a pattern. And this isn't somebody who's looking for patterns. Within 2 days of putting in a complaint, each time you lose your community support worker. And it's nothing to do with the complaint, but it does because Diana Wiggins put it in writing. And I would like that addressed. I don't even know if you're going to do this, to be honest with you, because it's pretty obvious. My support worker was withdrawn as part of refocusing North Recovery team towards what is referred to as a recovery model. So the reason she gets withdrawn is nothing to do with the complaint. It's got to do with being part of your new policy of a recovery model. Well, that's what happened the second time. What happened the first time? If this has been done with a recovery model, how come they don't all get withdrawn at the same time? And if it's all to do with the recovery model, which is the second time she's withdrawn, what was the reason for her being withdrawn? This is terrible. Here goes. Just before my tribunal, during my session with the doctor, why did he have something that said I had a history of taking people hostage? Where did this information come from? Please justify its accuracy. Was he given the information in an attempt to discredit the claims that I had Asperger's, thereby protecting those who had misdiagnosed me for so many years from having to answer these questions? Well, that's a bit frivolous, that bit. It's almost melodrama. Okay, I've looked at the text and I'm going to go through one sentence here, which is the reason I think more than one person wrote up this response to the complaint. Dr. Jolly has examined both the medical and AMHP reports presented at your tribunal. There is no nursing report on file, and it is not clear if a written report was submitted to the tribunal. Now, in the actual tribunal report, or court report that came out, or whatever you want to call it, it lists everything in it, and including what's listed in it is written evidence and who wrote the written evidence. But it says here it is not clear if a written report was submitted to the tribunal. A written report was submitted to the tribunal because Dr. Walsh had it in his possession and he read it out. Let alone that my solicitor had a copy. And I think part of how the tribunal works is you have written evidence. So just go to Daisy Day, mental health professional, a Mental Health Act officer, and ask for a copy of the court report for the 29th of the 2nd, 2012, involving me, and just look at it and you'll see there's written evidence and who wrote it. And why was Dr. Dale, if he wrote anything on that, why was he omitted for being an author? This is embarrassing. Here goes. Neither reports on record make reference to you having held anybody hostage. Well, earlier in this particular written response that you've given me to complaint, you mentioned that a doctor said when I talked to him for less than a minute at a door and asked him about something, that I held him hostage. and this was put down in the evidence in front of the tribunal. Well, even if there isn't written evidence that I was accused of taking people hostage that you can't obtain for the tribunal, there is written evidence in this response to the complaint, because you've mentioned it. So it's ridiculous to say that there's people going around making this accusation about me. Well, according to what's written in this particular answer to the complaint, you've actually put it down in this complaint. So it's not ridiculous, you've actually put it down in this complaint itself. So I'd like to question why you're saying it's ridiculous when that you're going around making this. If the purpose of the tribunal is not to ascertain specific diagnosis, but to determine the circumstances in which a person should continue to be detained, and the word hostage taking was used as part, incorporated into as part of why whether or not it should be detained. If the purpose of the tribunal is not to ascertain specific diagnosis, but to determine the circumstances in which a person should continue to be detained, and the word hostage taking was used as part, incorporated into as part of why whether or not it should be detained. Well, I think finding evidence of that, and that being a false accusation, would mean that part of what they used to decide whether or not I could be detained had little basis to it. And I think the response to this complaint, this written response, contains evidence that that accusation was made, because you put it down in writing earlier. Okay, the last bit, this is embarrassing. Here goes, from the text about taking people hostage or whatever. With such information to have been presented to the tribunal, it is possible that it may have influenced the decision to further detain you. As above mentioned, Dr. Jolly could find no evidence that it was presented. Well, here in the answer to terrible issue 1.2, it's on about on the 24th of February 2012, you have been presented as very paranoid and anxious, and blocked the ward door, stopping Dr. Armayous, Armayous, from going out. Now, at the tribunal, when I asked them about hostage taking, they said, well, for example, you took Dr. Armayous hostage. That's what they said when I stopped him at the door. They said that was an act of hostage taking. That was an example. They used that in the tribunal as an act of hostage taking, and said that, and other accusations I knew about hostage taking, was a reason, was to be incorporated in a reason for the tribunal to keep me detained. Now, Dr. Jolly could find no evidence. The problem is the same things at the tribunal, and what's in the written report is separate. But I'll put this to you. When I was there, I met another patient called John Ryan, and I met him years earlier. And you'd leave and he'd say, what did they diagnose you as? And I'd say schizophrenia, and he'd say, yeah, me too. So that's what seems, I asked why everybody seems to be diagnosed as schizophrenia. This time I met John Ryan after leaving the tribunal, and it was almost deja vu. What are they saying about you now? And I says, oh, they're going around saying I'm a hostage taker. And he says, well, it's funny you should say that, as if he knew something. I'd like to know if the patient John Ryan was ever accused of being a hostage taker, or when he said that, did he know something about it? Is there some type of trend of going around saying people are taking people hostage when we're not taking people hostage? Because that accusation was used once before on me, when someone made a crank phone call, and I want to know if crank phone calls. Okay, I'm now going to take a break. I got a lot there done in an hour or something. And And I'm going to come back and do the final two, which is 11 and 12. And I can see now why Dr. Phelan, when he looked at all this dribble, which is what it is, I can't believe you put an assessment, you got a team of consultants to put together this report. And I can see now why he had a lack of input into supporting any mention of me having schizophrenia, considering that he himself... Okay, the next one has nothing to do with any of the issues. Each time an answer is given to one of the points or one of the issues, to show that you've done it, and that the person who's answered has answered it with the right credentials. I'm assuming that Dr. Jolly is the one whose expertise are involved here, but with the way it's written, etc., and the lack of rhythm or whatever that's in it, I'm curious that all the text that's put here, is it all Dr. Jolly? And if it's not, anyone else involved in putting in the text, could they be referenced? In other words, all that's written in this report, it's either all Dr. Jolly, in which case there is no referencing, it's Dr. Jolly, but if there's anyone else involved in the text, could you reference who it is? Just so we know the area of expertise that is brought to answering each bit of each complaint, that the right person with the right expertise is there to answer it. Okay, this is nonsense. I was seen in a dishevelled state. Why, Dr. Phelan is always dishevelled. Nobody's taken away his liberty. And it also says I'd often be gone for days or weeks. I never left my flat. I was gone for a night even, or a day. I'd always go back to my flat to sleep. I was never disappeared for days or weeks and came back dishevelled like a cat that came in from the cold. That's a lie. That's just some social worker getting engaging in hearsay with my neighbours who I don't get on with, and they say annual nonsense, and it should not end up at a court of law and be regarded as evidence. It's ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. Someone says something outrageous and it's used as evidence. If you take away someone's liberty, that's judge and jury. Alright, incidents of aggression and non-compliance and all the rest of it. You're saying that I was, because of the way others would behave towards me, I was delicate and vulnerable, I was at risk. And then you're turning around, and what are you saying? Incidents of aggression and non-compliance. Anyone who I'd be having a discussion with was a lot bigger than me, and I've never attacked anyone. I don't have a history of violence. So you're making myself out to be a lost puppy brought me out of the cold 1 minute, and the next minute you're saying I'm dangerous. In the same answer, you're contradicting yourself, and I'd like to know why that is. I mean, it's ridiculous. In justifying my liberty to be taken away because I was hostile towards neighbours and various things happened, and the police were supposed to be called. On that particular occasion, I came in to Gloucester House on a Monday morning to be assessed if I was in a state where my liberty could be taken away. I was assessed by Dr. Phelan. He said I was fine. He asked me the questions. I left. The person who was there when I was assessed was Ken Little. He wasn't happy. So he put in the file something that now overturns Dr. Phelan's opinion. Dr. Phelan is a consultant. Ken Little is a social worker. If he doesn't like his opinion, he shouldn't have some type of vendetta or put something onto my file that changes what Dr. Phelan put there, because he works for Dr. Phelan, not vice versa. Since when do social workers overturn the opinions of consultants? It's ridiculous, and most of what they're putting down here is hearsay and lies. It's ridiculous. There's no basis to make him to do an opinion based on fact. Alright, it says a neighbour was investigated who attacked me, but no charges were brought due to me being unwilling to press charges. What actually happened was, the police said allegedly to what I said. Then I proved that I was telling the truth. Forensically, because I kept some glasses with some saliva on them. Then they gave an account how I attacked someone. Then I showed that account couldn't be true because there's a tree in the way I couldn't be seen. And then they made out that I wasn't attacking. It was found that I wasn't fighting or attacking someone, and the guy was bigger than me. He had admitted to what he'd done. I asked for charges to be pressed. The police went away. They came back, and even though I admitted the serious assault, the police said they weren't going to charge or arrest him. Now, this wasn't me unwilling to press charges. This was the police calling me a liar, then saying I told the truth, then refusing to allow me to press charges. So it's not my unwillingness to take action. Issue 12. What plans does the Trust have to investigate whether or not there are other patients with autism? Okay, the answer to issue number 12 is very, very easy. I can't believe a consultant came up with this. Simple schizophrenia. A diagnosis commonly made where there's no clear psychotic symptoms such as delusional belief, hallucinations, and hallucinations are not evident. Well, there's various things going on here. Number one, I wasn't diagnosed as that, so that's no excuse for me. You said paranoid. And number two, a person's got a condition where the symptoms aren't evident. The symptoms aren't evident because they're not there. Not alone are you misdiagnosing by not analysing the symptoms properly. Well, they're not there. You simply say they're not evident. Now, this happened in Russia. It was called slow-burning schizophrenia. And they used it as an excuse to lock up anyone. You're behaving like it's Russia. Bow your head in shame. Get out of the service. The Trust does not have plans to systematically review persons diagnosed with schizophrenia under its care to exclude the possibility that they suffer from Asperger's syndrome. Does this mean that you have plans to review persons under your care to include the possibility of Asperger's syndrome? Does it mean you look out for it? And if you do, does that mean you're going to exclude schizophrenia? Or corollary to the last point, if you don't have plans to review for people with schizophrenia to exclude Asperger's, or to review to include Asperger's, if it's neither, can you answer whether or not you have plans to review people diagnosed with schizophrenia to see if they have Asperger's, considering that is found to have cases like this in the past? Considering you've had cases like this in the past and mistakes have been made because you haven't looked out for them, how can your solution be that you have no plans to look out for something as a solution because in the past the problem came about because you weren't looking out for it in the first place? How is ongoing behaviour where you've said that it's a mistake to do, that continuing to do that, putting down that you're continuing to make a mistake, somehow remedies the mistake? Now, I don't know who's the expert here, but like, you got a team of consultants to put this together. You included Qureshi, Phelan, Dr. Dale, and Dr. Jolly, and God knows who else. I'm putting forward, this is just a little criticism to your this big report you came out with that I've been waiting. Okay, your recommendation to everything that's going wrong, what you're going to do is you're going to send out a load of raw statistics. I hope when you do send them out to me that they're compiled and meaningful, firstly, and secondly you're going to do a screening questionnaire. Well, As regards the statistics that you're going to send out to me and the screening questionnaire, I can't say for myself because I don't have the expertise to know whether that's adequate or not, but what I can say is that I'll send those to the Autistic Society, the Autistic Society, to see whether or not that is a valid remedy. Right. And those are my concerns. I can't believe it.
It is a type of phone. It's an audio recorder.
Yeah.
Speaks.
I don't think we can have this recorded. I'm afraid.
I'm afraid we can, because I don't have a power advocate with me.
All right. Well, if you wish, I suppose. Because this is really an opportunity for you to amplify things so that we can make sure that
you don't have to amplify the complaint.
You don't have to, no.
The complaint on its own, with the substance that's to it. They're very clever at the use of language.
So are there any things you wanted to kind of, up for me?
Develop.
Or anything additional that you'd like to add to that? That's really what the purpose of meeting today, make sure we've got everything, perspective on things.
Well, first incidence of psychosis recovery, support team. How can you have psychosis recovery?
May I have a look at that?
Yes, you sent it to me, I didn't send it to him.
Oh, that's just what I work in, that's just the team I work in.
You put back together personalities, is that even moral or possible? It's all confusing.
That's just
that's why you should have a pass.
That's just the letterhead of the team I work in.
Yeah, that's just the description. What's that? That's not. Anyhow, let's go through the complaint. Okay.
I've got a copy of it here, you've got a copy there too.
What have you read from it, all this nonsense? Why the hell doesn't somebody else do this? Why do I have to do it? They're making me out to be bloody...
You don't have to, I mean, we can just...
Well, I do have to, because I feel that I know and pass. That's another complaint I put in. You are Michelle.
So, there's one of the things that's happened that since you've been given this diagnosis about...
The place where I live.
Look ahead, is that right?
I've lived in homeless hostels. What they do is they put together a spreadsheet, and if you have a spreadsheet, you've got labels down one side, cells down another side, and you have various types of cells. What they do is they try and tick a box for a cell, and numeric value is also a financial value, so they try and tick all the boxes on a spreadsheet. When they're day 1, you're schizophrenic. Day 2, you're paranoid, schizophrenic, etc. They're going to do it anyhow because they get paid. Business, it's a business, it's nothing else. But the last time I was here, Tim Gorbash put his line through this,
right,
and said we can't let that slide.
Brennan stated to his GP.
Oh, what happened was, go to the back of my psychiatrist and my social worker like that.
Right.
And I said only joking. And
you think it was misinterpreted?
No, what happened was Gorbash deliberately put a line through it. Right. And then he said to me, we have to take this seriously. And he paused. And from then on, I let him trash the last complaint. It's not going to happen this time. Until we get down to me.
That you think that was a misunderstanding?
I said was a misunderstanding, but I said...
And it says that that's untrue, is it?
Let's not dwell on that. Let's read the whole thing in context.
That's an example, I suppose, of a circumstance where you feel that you've been
written and perceived. Written is different to what's... In other words, you said, oh, that guy, that's obvious. Gordon knew that. And I've got a copy of his report into my computer. Oh, I went smashed. Oh, yeah. Police observed. Read that, the handwritten bit. Oh.
Called into your room at 5, into your...
I know him, I've known him for 20. He's still trying to find out where I live and get my...
Yeah.
He wants to talk to me on behalf of my father.
Right.
The last people in the world I want to see. Anyhow, we'll get through this bloody thing. Okay. You got the complaint. Where did you make this phone? I was diagnosed, but... Okay.
I think the essential issue is that you feel there has been a misdiagnosis, you think?
Mostly. Because I didn't mean to bring all this paper and show it to you. It's like what you would have looked at it yourself in advance. Just a Mosley report, being a consultant.
Because I've seen that, yes.
Oh, you have, so it's not what I feel.
I've been sent a copy of that. I think that's the one.
Right. It's not just something I feel, it's actually...
I'm not sure if I've got the whole... Actually, if I might get somebody to make a copy of this,
Make a copy of this, the last report. I'm not from it, an assessment team. Oh, lovely.
She's making copies, so we'll...
Okay, you're fine. We have 10 minutes.
Right.
So I'm going to do a James Cagney type of style.
Alright.
And get it done quickly. You're not very American. You sound very English or something. How long
I've
have you
been
been in
here
England for?
more than 30 years now.
And what age are you?
No, since my early 20s. Yeah.
Early 20s. But you don't even sound Australian.
I do a bit, yeah.
Not the slightest. And anyhow, here goes. I won't go through this bit here because it's annoying. Who made the diagnosis of schizophrenia originally?
Yeah. You want to look, I think that's something...
Okay, I'd say that was Dr. Ahmed.
Dr. Mahmoud.
Oh, geez, you know. God, it's wonderful. You don't know something, then you know it. Very, very... Trust is the basis of everything. Okay. Why was I misdiagnosed as schizophrenic for so many years?
One of the limitations of this work is that, when you go, 2004 was when that happened. There's one of the issues is we rely upon the records at the time. Always the issue with that is whether the records accurately reflect.
Okay, I understand what you're saying. Okay, I'm going to ask how come there are so many experienced and qualified mental health professionals being involved in my case and they also didn't spot it?
One of the problems, I suppose, with this, we'll come back to this, conditions like schizophrenia they don't always show, somebody can be well after having an episode. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're... One of the big problems about schizophrenia is people have a tendency to kind of say somebody is schizophrenic. There's no such thing as schizophrenic. A person can have an episode, then they make a good recovery. Kind of inappropriate to say that they're schizophrenic.
Okay, about here.
And I suppose that's one of the issues.
Okay, well, I've got to, 12 o'clock?
Yep.
Okay, I thought I had an hour.
We can have a bit more time if you want, yeah.
Okay. Why was I given such a serious diagnosis without any diagnostic assessment? In other words, why do you do it in 5 and it takes 5 hours at the most, like
that's
5 minutes as opposed to 5 hours?
The Maudsley service is a very specialised service. This is something that's a reasonable concern that we will...
Okay, I was asked if I heard voices, I said no. Then they asked me, do thoughts ever pop into you? I looked at the psychiatrist and I said, yes, and I said, have a cigarette. Put down, thoughts popped into my head.
Oh, thoughts pop into everybody's head.
That's the basis on which I was diagnosed. Okay, here goes again. You heard about that, that's Dr. Ahmed. You know what they do, they pick people up. I hope you're not shrinking me.
No, I'm just taking a note that you said
shrinking is
the basis on which you were diagnosed schizophrenic.
All the points here. Why was I factually incorrectly diagnosed at the tribunal of being paranoid schizophrenic in 2012?
Because that's the same old issue of why it happened in the first place. It happened in 2004 already, isn't it?
This is a very important thing, I know. And I thought this was clarification. I didn't think it was actually amplification.
Just a clarification.
Can you define the difference between clarification and amplification?
Well, I suppose clarification is to make things clear which are not clear, whereas amplification is to...
Can you define amplification?
By a chance to develop your complaint by...
Develop, it doesn't mean volume.
Doesn't mean volume. Well, doesn't mean volume necessarily.
It doesn't mean an increase of.
No, not necessarily.
Not necessarily.
Well,
okay.
It can just to
must be a medical term.
Just to give a bit more breadth and so on. For example, what you said about somebody's thoughts pop into your head and just saying, yeah, good example of a circumstance. Treat it really.
The factual example. Okay, here goes again. Why was this factually incorrect in that diagnosis given at the tribunal? At the tribunal, I got the tribunal report here, and here is the written evidence by these people. Written evidence. Have you ever been to one of those tribunals?
I have, yes.
That written evidence said I was a hostage taker. I never took anybody hostage. I've never been to courts for even water. Anyhow.
Sorry, I'll just go. Oh great, I'll come out and get them, thanks. Just while you think about that, I'll go and get you copies. Just I'll be back.
Jesus.
Okay, so that's one, and that's the other one. Labels back in them again.
Oh,
that's
all right.
And I'll keep that. Sorry, go on, you were saying?
Anyhow, here goes. How has the Trust been complying with the Royal College of Psychiatrists guidance for looking out for Asperger's syndrome in the Council report CR1? I don't understand that.
I think it basically means what's the Trust doing to keep...
Have you adopted the CR1?
Sure of that, that's something I need to look at.
Could you give an answer to that?
Yeah, sure.
Whether or not you're looking into it. How can the Trust evidence that it is assessing for autism as part of the mental health assessment process? We're going to look at this and answer it anyhow.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's really, if there are things that are... I mean, it seems to me that, I mean, your reason for meeting was just to make other evidence you
I know, you needed clarification on the different amplification. Anyhow, I suppose I'll let you cover up. Throughout my detention in hospital, those involved in my case were by such crucial information continuously ignored.
Who were they told by?
Would have been by Nicola Wakeham. You know Nicola?
She your advocate?
Worker. I've known her for 10 years. And she was fired 2 days after this complaint registered, taken in and told that she made me do this. She made me go to the Maudsley, but she didn't actually. She influenced me, and that was against the interest of the Trust. The person who said that was Diane Wiggins. Is that okay? Okay, that's nonsense. You're not going to answer that anyhow. Oh yeah, this is a nice one. You seem to have a one-size-fits-all approach to something that is diagnostic. How can something be diagnostic and one-size-fits-all? Is that not impossible?
Okay, well we can look into it.
In other words, 1 minute you're saying everybody's schizophrenic, now we've all got paranoid, we've all got personality disorders. Is that an old word for somebody with a dangerous mental illness that's come back into fashion?
No, it's true that there are fashions in psychiatric diagnosis to some extent, highlighted in recent years.
Okay.
So they look more for it. One of the things, we can address that in the report.
Okay, answer that in the report. You don't have a one-size-fits-all. I mean, in the report, when you're answering it, could you do a graph of a process? Could you do a distribution curve of what, whatever shape you want to do it, of what the different diagnoses are in terms of vertical bands, and what the frequency is supposed to be. Expected frequency is supposed, what the actual frequency is in the hospital, and determine whether there's parameters from what's expected, they're acceptable, and whether or not it falls outside those parameters.
If I can get that, I promise you that I can look into it.
You can easily just look at the hospital records and the diagnosis.
Yeah, that would mean looking over everything in the trust. And
you need to just do the categorisation.
Right. I might be able to get that information, but I can't.
Okay, that's fair enough.
Okay.
It's a lot of nonsense, do you agree that there has to be variation in order for something to be diagnosed?
I'm not sure what that means, actually.
Okay, variation means that there has to be different types of mental illness in here. The makeup has to be variable. It can't be too much of the one thing.
Some evidence of different diagnoses being provided for.
Yeah, the distribution, basically,
okay.
The breakdown.
Well,
is a breakdown is a breakdown as expected, and if it's unexpected, why?
Okay.
That's statistical analysis. Why was my only support? What the hell with this? Okay, let's see. Okay, I'll go through it. Okay. Why was I diagnosed as I was diagnosed? Why did that happen?
Sure, that's. We'll certainly be looking.
Why did you get it wrong? Why was I diagnosed with what I was diagnosed with? And why did you get it wrong? Well, I mean, this is for clarification.
Sure.
So you put me in the picture, and I do what I can to put you in the picture.
Okay.
Seeing as it's clarification, why was I diagnosed with what I was diagnosed with? And
that's really
I don't think that's something that goes through the complaint as a unifying theme.
Sure.
But in voicing it here, although it's not specifically written down in the complaint, we can address it here.
Well, the reason why people are given diagnosis is because they...
Okay, and why did they get it wrong?
I don't know the answer to that fully because...
Do you accept I was wrongly diagnosed? If you do not believe accept I was improperly diagnosed, why not? Wonderful clarification you have here. If I have a very clear mind, you don't need that. A very clear mind. You don't quite know. Anyhow, what are you doing to look out for people? I've done this before. Okay. If you find I was wrongly diagnosed, do you accept I was given incorrect medication and that this may have a severe effect on me physically, my ability to rate and my quality of life?
I'll answer that question. We can look into, but what medication did you think was in?
Olanzapine.
Olanzapine?
Yeah, that's enough.
Okay.
I'm obviously not going to get any more information. I didn't get any information out of you anyhow. You like Ronald Reagan answering questions. No, he's a footy-duddy and he doesn't know anything, and the next one doesn't know that.
Well, that's been very helpful to get those additional thoughts actually, and what I'll do is, and I'll read these documents as well that you've given me. I may have a copy of one of them. I don't think I've got a copy of the previous complaint that you...
One other little thing, do you know you keep having these recovery teams, North Recovery, South Recovery, Psychosis Recovery. What does the word recovery team mean?
Well, recovery is, I suppose, is a movement tries to give a little bit
of psychosis, yes.
Recovery, I mean, it's put it aside from the recovery, moving the agenda beyond broader agenda of people.
So psychosis recovery would be giving someone a fuller life who suffers from a psychosis, giving them more of a life worth living. That's where the word recovery in the recovery team comes from. Psychosis recovery team.
I'm not sure I think the recovery teams, the North and South recovery team, deal with
helping you recover from people from the North and the South.
They're not, they deal with people that have, most of the patients in them, many of the people don't have psychotic. There are some people in those teams that have never had psychosis.